All right, good morning, everybody. So my name is Stephanos. I'm a graduate student at the University of Colorado in medical genetics, and I'll be moderating today's session discussing participation in clinical trials, of which you've probably heard a lot about today, of course, during today's sessions on research especially. So I'm really happy to be joined here by Jess, the Senior Director of Clinical Development at Timber, as well as super excited to be joined by our panel participants, Aditya, Peyton, and Christina, who will be sharing their experience in the Timber clinical trial. But before we get into that, I wanted to give you a little bit of a background and a succinct and short background because I want to be mindful of the checkout time at 10:45, and of course want to hear more from the participants. Clinical research is extremely important, especially for our community in the context of developing and finding new drugs and treatments for our condition, for our community. It's really imperative that we as a community get together and find what trials are being available, many of those that were just discussed in the previous session, and participate so that we can see advancement in the field, so that we find new treatments that are able to improve the quality of life of us. So, I guess it's important to say, there's a big difference between clinical trials in our community as well as endemic diseases, and that's really, of course, related to how rare we are. Ichthyosis in general is already rare to have, let alone when you start dividing it by all of its different genetic etiologies or genetic subtypes. And so this is why it even becomes more imperative that we all participate, because we all know that one of the major themes that we've found out, that we've come to find out in this conference, is that our types of ichthyosis can be very different, although somewhat the same. And it's important that we get a great idea across many different types of what drugs would be safe and efficacious, or that would work well for each one of us. So what does it mean to be in a clinical trial? This is, whether it's like a clinical trial that's assessing a new treatment or whether it's actually for a diagnosis, as Dr. Schott discussed in the Yale registry, providing new diagnoses for patients. It shouldn't be taken lightly, or the decision to participate in a clinical trial shouldn't be taken lightly. It should be, of course, assessed by yourself. It should be discussed with loved ones and, of course, your physician to make sure that that trial is really right for you, and that the time commitment and the time commitment is something that you'd be okay with. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that today from our panel participants. So, as you can see, or maybe see on the TV, to either side of you, clinical trials come in many different phases, and these are used to assess, of course, the safety, to make sure that these drugs are not doing any harm, but then further to see if there's any signal of efficacy or to see if they work at all. And this progresses in different phases until this data is presented to the FDA, to which they will say whether or not that drug can be approved and go on the market for patients to be able to access that were not in the clinical trial. So after the trial is over and after the FDA does approve a drug, then you can be on it outside of the trial or when it is on the market. So I think it kind of goes without a presentation on participation in clinical trials to bring up my second favorite website, which is clinicaltrials.gov. And I really encourage all of you, whether or when you get home today, or maybe at the end of the sessions today, to go onto clinicaltrials.gov and search the keyword ichthyosis to see what kind of trials are currently being offered. You'll see many, of course, at centers that we are very familiar with here, including Yale and Northwestern, but many others. There are quite a few entries on the website that I think are very, it's imperative that we're aware of, and that you might be interested in participating in. So, with that, I want to now move on to the panel session where we'll learn more about what it actually means for a participant to join a clinical trial and go through the process. So thank you, and I'm excited to hear from everybody.
Thanks, Stephanos. So at this time, I'd just like to quickly give our panelists a quick opportunity to introduce yourselves, tell us just briefly who you are, where you live, and then we'll get into our questions.
Thank you guys so much for the panel opportunity. Hi everybody, my name is Aditya Badetti. I'm a 27-year-old MD PhD student, just finished defending my thesis. I'm a 6th year at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, and first in my family with diagnosed X-linked ichthyosis, and a recent participant in the Timber Pharmaceuticals phase 2B clinical trial.
I am Peyton. I'm 12 years old. I am from Agawam in Massachusetts, and I live with my mother, so.
My name's Christina Flegel, and this is my son Peyton. We're from Agawam, Massachusetts, and Peyton took part in phase 2 of the Timber clinical trials as well for his X-linked ichthyosis. He's the first in our family to be officially diagnosed, but we do know that my father, uncle, and cousins also suffer from the same condition, even though he's the one to be officially diagnosed with it.
Okay, so first question. How did you find out about the clinical trial?
So I first reached out to the Yale Ichthyosis Registry, gave the saliva sample. Growing up, my first dermatologist told me it was eczema when I was very little, and my parents were like, no, that doesn't sound right. But then we later found out from another dermatologist that it was actually ichthyosis, but we never actually had any closure on what type of gene was mutated potentially, because nobody in our family has had this, so we assumed it's like a spontaneous mutation. After reaching out, I did my own personal research after joining medical school on clinicaltrials.gov to see what might be available now that I had a diagnosis. And then I reached out to some of the research coordinators who then talked to me about my eligibility for some of the upcoming clinical trials.
I originally found out by the trial because my mother found it out from a cousin, I believe, and their cousin wanted us to try it out, so we just tried it, and here we are.
So as I said before, we do have other people in the family who are affected, just haven't had that actual diagnosis. So a cousin of mine originally found out about the trial, reached out to everyone in the family that she knew was affected to see if anyone else would be interested in doing the trial. Peyton ended up being in the trial, as well as my uncle who lives in Florida. He also was a part of the trial and also eventually got his diagnosis as well.
Awesome, thank you guys. Can you discuss the early enrollment in the trial? What kind of interface you had, of course, with Timber and especially your physician?
We ended up working with Yale down in Connecticut, which luckily isn't far from our home. And we learned all about the trial, what the medication was going to be on, what Peyton would have to do, and we were just very excited and hopeful, even though it was a double-blind study, that Peyton would get the active medication and it was something that was going to be able to help him. So there was a lot of information, a lot of learning about his official diagnosis, and just a lot of excitement involved.
So she kind of really just summarized everything, so can't say much.
Yeah, for me, we also participated at the Yale Center, and the first screening process was done in person. But because of COVID-19, subsequent visits were actually, fortunately, able to be done over Zoom in as a form of telemedicine. But we had to make the drive, in particular, from New Jersey to Connecticut, which is a little bit further.
Great. So when you were trying to make the decision as to whether or not you wanted to participate, what were some of the biggest questions or concerns that you had?
So for me, this is the first clinical trial that I was personally participating in as a participant. And so I was more inquiring about maybe what are the potential side effects of the medication that I would encounter, because for me, I've never been so forthcoming for a clinical trial that was not already approved on the market, that we would have all those details in.
I didn't really have any questions other than, does it actually work? But the doctors couldn't even answer that because it was a double-blind test, so we just had to go in to find out if it did.
So as Peyton said, it was a double blind, so we didn't know if it was going to work. For us, it was kind of a no-brainer. It's something that Peyton has struggled with his entire life. He's always, had trouble with his itchiness, and especially in the wintertime, just suffering, from ichthyosis. So if there was a chance that we could try something that was going to hopefully help him, for us it was a no-brainer that of course we'd want to try something and we would be hopeful that it would work, and we were very lucky that it did, and his skin improved so much that by the end of the trial it didn't even look like he was affected at all.
That's really great to hear. Thank you, guys. Can you maybe get into some challenges that you may have faced throughout the trial so far, if there have been any?
I'll let Peyton speak for most of it, but it definitely got worse before it got better. There was a shedding phase, and There was times that he wanted to quit, and I just encouraged him, let's push through this, let's get to the other end. And once we got through about that 2-week period of the intense itchiness and the shedding, he was so happy he got to the other side. But I'll let him talk about the actual experience of getting through the worst before it got better.
As she said, it definitely got worse than it got better because the body just wants to get all the scales off, and then after it does, if you just keep up with lotion and other things, then the scales don't come back, and it barely looks like I even have ichthyosis. So I would say it is most definitely worth the 2-week period, because it might seem like a long time, but after you get clear of scales, it just seems like a short amount of time to be clear for the rest, as long as you keep up with moisturization.
So I feel like for me, the challenges were like twofold. One was the logistical challenge of having to arrange for the visits in person when it had to be in person for the trial. Just needed to like take a day off from work or from school and arrange all those things. But that was something that we worked very closely with the research coordinators and the dermatologists to overcome, and that was no issue afterwards. For me, the same side effects, it got worse before it got better. I had to be very careful of washing my hands after using the medication. I, very early in the trial, accidentally touched my lips and completely cut up all of the corners of my mouths, and it was like very, very painful, and it was like very like visible fissures. But that's just the testament to that it was actually in the treatment group and not in the placebo group, and it was the potency of it was very profound. Also, early on in the trial, because we were told to do it twice a day, I was typically doing it very quickly before sleeping, and then I really found that it was very difficult to fall asleep. It was very, very itchy during the nights. I was tossing and turning constantly, but then after talking with my dermatologist, we arranged that instead of doing it right before bedtime, it was kind of like a 5, 6 p.m. type of arrangement, and then it would allow the ointment to really seep into the skin, and then any itching would be like during the night, but not when I'm trying to fall asleep.
Great. So I think what a lot of people here would like to understand is what do you think you want to tell others about, potentially joining trials, whether it be this or any of them that, Dr. Powell or Dr. Cho talked about. The idea of, I always like to say, I think joining a clinical trial is the greatest altruistic act that anyone can do. You don't know what's going to happen for you. And so by doing so, you're putting yourself out there, not only for yourselves, but for future generations of yourselves, right? And it is something that the community has to understand, recognize, appreciate. But then also, what do you want to tell them about joining trials in general?
For sure. I think for me, it's kind of almost like selfish motivation, because it's really cool to see data from your participation. Like, it's like, wow, that RNA-seq data was my patient, like my samples. Or it was because of me that I was able to progress this trial from phase 1, 2, 3 to eventually getting FDA approval. And I think that, as Jess said, the altruistic component of it really is a driver. For me personally, interested in research and clinical trials in my future, I found it really motivating and inspiring to be on the participant side. Now I know the perspective that when I try to go and inquire and engage people to join clinical trials, not just for ichthyosis, but for any disease, I think that I would be able to tell them, hey, I was on your side too.
I just think that it was cool that I was able to help myself by applying the medication and also help future generations in the process, and maybe even generations of now, because now you can, when the medication actually goes up for you to be able to buy, you can just apply it and get all the scales off, and now you're free. It's been the first time I was free since I was 2, so it's lovely.
I know for us, having so many people in our family affected and knowing that it's something that will get passed down through our family, not only is it something that is helping Peyton and hopefully will help others, it'll help the rest of our family, knowing that it's something he can pass on to his children, something that I have a younger sister that her children could be affected by, and I just think it's great to do something that we know will be able to help our family later down the line and help others that are affected to, you know, hopefully have the results that Peyton had, where he doesn't even look like he's affected anymore. And as he said, he's free. He's scale free for the first time since he was 1.5, 2 years old. So once we got all the scales off, it was the first time that he wasn't itching all the time, and our house wasn't covered in flakes of skin, and he could fall asleep without scratching himself all night long. And that was just amazing, and we hope others will be able to experience that too. And, you know, as they said, that only happens if we're able to test this medication and find out if it works.
Yeah, so that was wonderful. And you know, my last question is, what was kind of surprising about the trial, or what's something that you all learned that was new, that you weren't aware of before, maybe even about your own condition or the medication that that is going through the trial?
When Peyton was young, 1.5, 2, and his scales started to appear, we went to a dermatologist, and I remember he pulled out this huge book, and he pointed to a couple of pictures, and he said, I think it's one of these, but I don't know which one. And we really didn't know anything other than he told us it was a severe form of eczema. And so we kind of just blundered through the first 10 years of his life, trying out different creams and ointments and lotions. We tried different prescriptions. Nothing really worked. Nothing really helped. The scales started on his shins, then it went to his thighs, and it went to his abdomen, then it was on his arms, and it started creeping up his neck. And by the time, you know, we started the trial, it was over his entire body. So finding out about the trial and then finding out his exact diagnosis, we were able to learn more about what he has and how we can help him, and really just put a name and a label on it. And that's how we found out about FIRST. I know a lot of people find FIRST and, you know, from their dermatologist sooner, and we didn't even know about it. So just discovering there's a whole community, there's more people, you know, like Peyton that he can relate to, that has been wonderful, just the wealth of knowledge that we now have. So his entire life, he's always said, Mommy, I'm more sensitive to pain. And we always just thought, oh, okay. It turns out he is more sensitive to pain. You know, we as a family love to go hiking. We're involved in Boy Scouts. He has a lot of trouble with that kind of stuff, and now we know why. So it's kind of ticked a lot of those boxes and answered a lot of questions that we never knew earlier in his life, and I wish we had known. So it's been a big learning experience for us, and I feel that we blundered, like I said, for the first 10 years of his life until we found out about this. So it's been great to finally have a name and a label and to really figure out what we can do to better his quality of life.
She really said everything that we learned, but at least now I have an excuse to complain for hiking and other things. So, yay.
I think for me, the most surprising thing was how well-structured the clinical trial process was. We've come a long way from when I was little. Like, science has come so far, and to really appreciate how much research is going into something that I've been born with is really, it takes the breath away. And I think that it's really, really fascinating to be, this is my first conference, and so it's really cool to see such a nice, tight-knit community of people that are affected, siblings, family members, researchers, and clinicians all coming together to see how we can move forward and help the greater community. I think it's really nice, and I would never have found out about the FIRST program until I joined the clinical trial, actually, so I'm really thankful for that as well.
Great. So I guess the last question that I would have, again, trying to be respectful, I know we all have to check out in the next 15 to 20 minutes or so. Just if there's any last words that you want to impart upon the group here about your experience, about, like you said, you know, what it meant to you when you actually did have to travel and attend those visits. What did you expect during those visits? Is it what you thought it was what was going to happen? Were there any parts of the trial that made you uncomfortable or that you were unsure about, and how did you overcome any of that?
Sure. I definitely encourage everybody to participate if they're eligible in the upcoming phase 3 trial, and not only for this, but for other clinical trials related to ichthyosis. I think that all the things that have been said already today really spark true. And I think that in terms of challenges and everything and what people might be able to expect, I think really working with the clinicians and the research coordinators on scheduling those visits, anything you might need. If anything comes up during the trial that may make you anxious about whether or not you can continue, something that's all the clinicians and research coordinators are willing to discuss with you. And if it gets too severe, what are your options and everything. I think that everybody is very supportive. Everybody wants to move forward. So it's just about whether the will is there. And I think that if you are willing, then people will help you along the way.
Like he said, I would most definitely suggest trying to get into the trial or just trying the medicine when it does come out. It's just been very beneficial, and I love it. It was just a bit awkward during when I had to go there because I had to miss a bit of the beginning of school, and it was a bit annoying to just take photographs all over my body. So that was a bit annoying, but I'm done.
We did end up going through a lot of this during COVID, but we did, have to drive down to Connecticut. It was about an hour and a half away. Peyton's, his least favorite part was that it was right next to IKEA, so it was an excuse for me to go shopping afterwards. But, overall, I think it was worth the time. I would have to take time off work. He did take some time out of school to be able to drive down there for some of the initial visits, for the blood work, and then for the final visits. And then with COVID, we did a lot of it over Zoom. They sent us home with a camera, and we were able to take the pictures in our own home, which was interesting. We turned our living room kind of into a photo studio, and we used a big blue blanket. We hung it up in the door to try and give us a nice backdrop. But overall, I think it was worth everything that we had to do with the time out of school, the time out of work, the driving, the pictures, even the first couple of weeks that he found uncomfortable. In the end, it was all worth it. And even though he did go through a time where he said, I don't want to do this anymore, and I encouraged him to keep going, we got through that hard part, we got through the shedding, and afterwards, he even said that he thought it was worth it, and it's just been amazing the difference that it's made in his life. One of my favorite things about Peyton is that he doesn't care what other people think. So having ichthyosis has never really affected him socially, but it has affected his quality of life in that he's itchy and it's hard for him to sleep, and his skin would irritate him, and he walks around scratching all the time. So even though it wasn't a social thing for him, he definitely had that increased quality of life and not having to always be itchy and worrying about his skin and thinking about how irritated his skin was. And I think that it was definitely worth it for him to be able to go through that. And we're hoping, that this is going to be something that's going to be available for others, and we hope that they have the success that he had with it as well. If it's something that you think might help, we encourage you, try these clinical trials. Without the clinical trials, these medications wouldn't be available. Without these people doing this amazing work, Peyton wouldn't be scale-free, and that's just been something that has been absolutely amazing and freeing for our family, freeing for Peyton, and I think it's definitely worth the time that it takes, the inconvenience for the travel, to be able to get that for your family members and for, possibly others in your community as well.
Great. Well, I think with that, we're going to allow Jess to talk about the Timber Phase 3 trial.
Or I'll just ad-lib. Am I supposed to just forward it? Okay. So thank you all, and again, I recognize that we have to speed along here. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to say, overall, as a researcher, I am here to promote this particular study in the next 5 minutes, but truly, getting involved in research, whether it be in academia or with industry. I was in a session yesterday with Dr. Benjamin, who said that she had to learn over her life as a MD that pharmaceutical industry is not necessarily the big evil wolf that is down the hall that a lot of people like to think. We are truly trying to do this research to better all of your lives and your experiences. So I encourage you to participate when you can. This is the only opportunity that we can get in order to have new drugs and therapies available for you. So the phase 3 study is the next step, as Stephanos had explained, after a phase 2, which is the last study that is required before you go for FDA approval. It is the largest study, so it will be looking at about 142 patients with both ARCI and X-linked type ichthyosis. It is a global study, whereas the last study was largely in the US. Here, we will have participation not only in the US, but in Canada, France, Germany, and Italy. So a rather large study. There are a few key questions that need to be answered as part of this phase 3 study. So first and foremost is around safety. This continues to be something that we continue to evaluate in all of our clinical trials. So one of the biggest components that is important in this particular trial, and it has to do with the entire range of ages, and I'll get to why this is so important. We cannot do trials specifically in adults and then expect the drug to be able to be used in pediatric patients, right? So we need not only adults, but brave young men like Peyton, to agree to participate in trials, because drugs affect children differently, right? And without doing that research to understand what those differences might be and to be able to collect all that data across various age ranges means that we would not have a drug that we could say is approved for use in patients under the age of 18. So you'll see in this particular trial, we are recruiting patients as low as 6 years old. And so it's really important that the FDA, when we go to submit, sees that we in fact did enroll patients. And so in our last study, it was 9 and above. Based on the safety data from that study, they agreed to allow us to go down as low as 6 years old. They actually asked us to go to 2. We kept it at 6. And we will continue to do research to understand how we best meet the needs of those youngest patients, those neonates to the 6-year-olds. So it's a continual step-by-step process as we continue to do research. That this important component will be looking specifically at whether or not this topically applied retinoid has any systemic absorption in the blood. So it will require additional blood testing throughout the study to be able to ascertain whether or not the retinoid that's being applied topically has the same absorption as if you were taking something orally, right? The big purpose of presenting this in a topical form is that our hope is, and initial studies have shown, that it's not getting absorbed into the blood similar to the oral. And so those systemic side effects that many of you are aware of as it relates to orally consumed retinoids would no longer be there, or would be there at a much, much lower frequency. The other thing that we're looking at safety is in terms of what we call local skin reactions. And these are some of the things that both Peyton and Adasi spoke about. This is when your skin begins having a burning and itching sensation when it's first applied. The class of retinoids is known to do this. It's something that typically would happen. Similar if you ever used it for acne, or anyone in your family used it for acne purposes. So we'll be continuing to follow that and understand what that looks like, as well as things like erythema, redness, and edema. And of course, also looking to see if there are any other additional side effects. Then you look at efficacy, and efficacy is, does the drug work, right? And so from this perspective, we're looking at reduction in scaling and fissuring. Dr. Choate talked about the fact that they were coming up with new measures to be able to assess the severity of scaling with ichthyosis patients. We are using the VIS scale in this study as well, but he also indicated that there's a newer scale that's available. And so as you hear, there are continuously new procedures and new tests and new ways to think about how to affect your ichthyosis. And so as a research community in whole, both in academia and in industry, we are trying to partner together to be able to bring you as a community the best medicines with the best outcomes. Additionally, what we're looking for from an efficacy
perspective is around quality of life. And so the way that we do that is through questionnaires. So patients will take a baseline questionnaire before they start the drug and ask some questions about their daily life and how their ichthyosis is affecting their daily life. And then in 2 other time points throughout the study, you ask those same questions and see if any of that has changed. Potentially your bathing routine, has it become less frequent or less time consuming? Things around odor, things around severity of itch, and things of that nature. So those are questions around quality of life that are included in the study. So the study design, I'm not going to get into great detail about this, but essentially the main study, as Dr. Paller indicated, is still a double-blind study, which means that there still is an opportunity that you could, if you enroll, get what we call the vehicle. It's not truly a placebo that many of you might be familiar with, and the reason it's not truly a placebo is that the vehicle is a moisturizing ointment in and of itself. So it's not as if we're telling you, hey, just rub water on your skin or rub on potentially our drug to see what the difference is. A true placebo, as people will call it, like a sugar pill, truly has nothing in it. So that's why we call it and we use the term of vehicle. It is a 2-to-1 randomization, however, so what that means is for every 1 chance that you get for the vehicle, there are 2 chances that you would be getting the active drug. And it is so incredibly important to understand why a double-blind study is kind of what's considered the gold standard for clinical trials. Oh, sorry, is there a question? Sorry? Oh, yeah, let me just finish this one thought and then yeah, absolutely. So a double-blind study is considered the gold standard because truly in that case, neither you nor your physician know what you're getting. And so when you're talking about how your skin feels, how your skin looks, there's no predisposed kind of thought process that, oh, I know they are on the active drug, they should be getting better, therefore I think they are, right? So it's really an opportunity to take bias out of the study and to be able to get really valid results. Sorry. Yes, there is. Yes, there is. So great question. So the way that the study is designed is the first 12 weeks of the study is actually the randomized part. And that's because it's at 12 weeks that we are looking at what's called the primary efficacy endpoint. We believe within 12 weeks, that would be a sufficient amount of time to show the scaling and reduction that we are aiming for. So at the end of that 12 weeks, patients that originally received active will continue on active, and they'll be randomized either to dropping down to a single daily dose or continuing at a twice daily dose. And those patients that had received the vehicle would essentially cross over for 12 weeks of the active. So even if you're initially randomized to vehicle, after 12 weeks and you stick it through, you will cross over and receive active for an additional 12 weeks. Yeah, sure. So, again, there are a lot of eligibility criteria, right? And what that means basically is when you go out to first speak with your physician to see whether or not you would be eligible for the study, they're going to run through a list of questions, right? They're going to figure out how severe is your ichthyosis. For this particular study, you've got to be moderate to severe in order to qualify. Mild cases of ichthyosis would not qualify for this study. Additionally, for the main efficacy study, which is what you see in white here, you only need to be treating between 10 to 90% of your total body surface area. So that's a discussion that you'll have with your physician, including areas of severity and where you are most comfortable and able to apply your study medication. Some of you may live alone and won't be able to apply to your back, and so therefore that wouldn't be included as part of your treatment area. However, as I was talking about earlier regarding the systemic systemic absorptions, there's an arm of the study that's called a maximal use arm. And in the definition of maximal use, when you're talking about patients with lamellar type disease, ARCI and X-linked disease, for the most part, they are affected head to toe. And so the idea is we need to be able to look at the safety if a patient were, in fact, to use it in what would be the maximal conditions, which by this definition is anywhere between 75 and 90% of your total body. Now, there are ways to determine exactly what percentage your arms are and your legs are and so forth. But to participate in that optional arm, which is the maximal use arm, you would have to apply to at least 75% of your body in order to be eligible for that particular part of the study. And that's where the extensive blood draws come in. The main study does not have that, so there is an option. The maximal use study is 12 weeks directly of open label. There is no potential of getting the vehicle during the maximal use study. Just a little bit about what your participation could look like. Some of this was already touched upon by the panel here. There could be travel, right? So we have 18 centers across the US. That's not even half of the states. We recognize that. However, we tried to be strategic in terms of where we placed the study, tried to hit major metropolitan cities and areas, and tried to be spent across the country as best as we could. But in all cases, you don't live 30 minutes away from the clinic. And so in that regard, we do reimburse for any travel that you need to take on as part of the trial, as well as if you're a parent caregiver of a pediatric patient, your travel is covered for as well, includes meals and so forth as well. In terms of time, this depends on the arm of the study, but you would need to make those clinic visits between 4 and 7 times over a 6-month period, right? And again, working with this research team, you'll be able to identify exactly when those would hit. Most of the time, the actual time in the clinic is about an hour to an hour and a half. Blood draws, I know this is never anyone's favorite thing, so I thought it was important to include here. As part of the main part of the study, there are 2 to 3 instances where you'd have to give blood for normal safety labs. It includes hematology and chemistry and things like that, and that helps us to follow your safety throughout the course of the study. In the maximal use arm, however, there are additional blood draws, and that's something that your physician can speak with you about as well. Finally, diaries and questionnaires. So I spoke about the questionnaires a little bit. That's what helps us to understand a little more about your quality of life and be able to ascertain whether or not taking this medication has actually had a positive impact on your overall life or not. Similarly, there's a diary in which you have to complete. This time, guys, it's an application, and it's an app on your phone and not a paper diary. And so you're going in and saying, yep, I applied my drug today, and I did it at 8 a.m. So those are some of the considerations and some of the things to think about. I talked about this a little bit, and the guys did as well. There both are in-clinic visits as well as remote visits, which are handled through telemedicine, as well as or Zoom-type applications, as well as the opportunity for home health care visits for the maximal use arm, for blood draws to be done out of the comfort of your own home. So there's a bunch of different ways in which we're trying to develop and work through these trials such that it is relieving as much of the burden on you and your family for participating as possible. Finally, I'll just leave this here. So there is a study website, which is www.ichthyosistrial.com. It talks about the study. It gives information about what the study arms look like. It will also provide what we call the study locator. You can type in your zip code and it will pop up the closest site to you. Again, some of you might be fortunate and have to take a half-an-hour drive. Others, it will be in the neighboring state. That they will provide you with the PI's name, study coordinator name, email address, so you can reach out to them directly for more information. Any questions? Yes. Great question. So there are what are called washout periods when you're going to enroll into a trial. Each trial has their own, depending upon what the needs of the trial are and what the objectives are. For something like this, there would be a washout. Don't quote me, I believe it is 3 months in order to get that out of the system. Now, that's a big deal for a lot of patients, right? So you're on a therapy that you know works, and now we're asking you to come off that therapy for a period of time. There's a whole continuum of different therapies. So for instance, keratolytics have a 5-day washout period and so forth. So within the context of the protocol, it talks about that. And much to your point, that's exactly the reason why we need that washout period, is to make sure that the effects that we are seeing from our drug are not confounded by the effects of the drug that they had previously been taking. So based off of science and half-lives of drug and all of that, that's how it's determined as to what the washout period would look like. But what we do is we encourage our physicians to kind of take that continuum and say, if you do have a patient who has to wash out for 3 months here, what would be the next step down and the next step down and the next step down to manage that time of the washout before they would actually start on the clinical trial? Great question, though. Yeah. You're about right. So it, unfortunately, I know you guys all want tubs of ointments. I know that, and we're trying through R&D to understand that. But what you need to understand is when you open a tub and expose things to air, there's sometimes things that happen. So as a result, these are in aluminum tubes. They look kind of like a toothpaste tube-ish. And so the largest patient, think of 50-year-old adult male, basically uses a tube in the morning and a tube in the evening. And so we've tried to design it in such a way to make it as easy as possible, but there's a lot of squeezing into a hand and rubbing all over. But we are continuing to do R&D work to understand if there's an opportunity to put it in a tub type of container, but there, as I said, there's a lot in terms of evaporation of the active drug and so forth. All right. Well, with that, I thank you so much. I believe everyone has to run and check out of their rooms if they haven't done so already. Thank you so much to our panelists. That was so incredibly helpful. All right.